In Kerr County, Texas, on the 11th of April 1882, the county let out the widow Vogel and bound out her 2 children on the courthouse steps at Pardee. And it took the better part of an hour, and the cicadas never once stopped in the live oaks. It was court day. The square smelled of horse and cedar dust and the sharp green smell that comes off the Guadalupe in April. And there were perhaps 90 people in it, most of them there for the mule sale. Halbert Crow was overseer of the poor for the precinct, and he ran a freight yard on the Kerrville Road, and he had the whole business arranged before he ever mounted the steps. The keep of the widow would be let to the lowest bidder, the county paying $11 a quarter for her board. The children would be bound out to the highest, to be taught a trade and kept till their majority, the boy to 21 and the girl to 18. Crow intended to have both children himself. He had counted them already the way a man counts a pair of yearlings, and he had not troubled to be quiet about it in the freight yard, because it had not once occurred to him that anybody would object. Susanna Vogel stood at the foot of the steps in a black dress gone brown at the shoulders, with a child's hand in each of hers. She was 27 years old, born in Texas to German people out of Fredericksburg, and she had been a widow 11 months. Carl Vogel had drowned in the Guadalupe in a flood in May of 1881, going after somebody else's cow, and had left her a leasehold she could not pay. $40, 2 children, and a reputation for pride that the precinct had decided it did not much care for. Greta was 7. Jonas was 5. Neither of them was crying, which was worse. "Now, ma'am," Crow said, "from the top step, there is no call for a scene. They will be fed and housed and taught, which is more than you have managed since May." Susanna Vogel did not answer him. There was no answer. She had spent 9 weeks writing letters and standing in that clerk's office and being told, patiently, by 4 different men, that a widow with no property and no husband had no standing to keep what the county had determined she could not feed. The bidding on the girl started at $2, and a man at the back of the crowd, near the hitch rail, who had come to town for a mowing blade and a keg of nails, said, "Hold on." He came through the crowd without hurrying. He was 35 or thereabouts, sun-cured, dark, quiet-moving, with a week of beard and a shirt gone soft with washing, and there was not one thing about him that 90 people in that square could have told you afterward, except that he did not raise his voice. "You are binding them out because she has got no husband," he said. "That is the whole of it. That is the only thing wrong. That is the law of it," Crow said. "Then I will fix it." He turned and took his hat off and spoke to Susanna Vogel directly, which nobody had done in an hour. "Ma'am, my name is Reuben Hayes. I have got 400 acres on the river, 11 miles south of here, and a house on it, and no wife, and no people. If you will marry me this morning, right here, they cannot bind out your children, because they will have a father with a house and 160 head. And this ends inside of 10 minutes. He turned the hat once in his hands. "I am not asking you for anything, not now and not later. You will have the house and the children, and I will have the barn, and if you want it undone in a month, I will pay for the undoing myself. But you have got to say it out loud, and you have got to say it now, because he is bidding." The narrator has told this story in 3 counties, and has never yet found anybody who could account for the next 11 seconds. Susanna Vogel looked at that man's face. She had never seen him before in her life. She did not know one thing about him, not where he came from, nor what he had done, nor whether he was kind, and she stood in the dust of that square with the cicadas going and made the largest decision of her life on nothing at all. "Yes," she said. Judge Pettibone was in the courthouse 40 feet away because it was court day, and he came out onto the steps and asked her plainly, in front of the whole square, whether she was acting of her own free will, and whether she understood she could say no. And Susanna Vogel said, "I am, and I do, and I will not." And it was done in 11 minutes. And Halbert Crow stood at the top of the steps with the bidding sheet still in his hand, and understood that he had been made small in front of 90 people by a stranger who had not even raised his voice. He never forgave it. Men of that particular kind do not. They went out the Guadalupe road in his wagon, the four of them, with a mowing blade and a keg of nails in the bed, and nobody saying anything for the first 4 miles. It was Jonas, aged 5, who broke it. "Are you our pa now?" "No," said Reuben Hayes. "Your pa was Carl Vogel, and he drowned getting a cow out of the river, which is a thing I would want said about me. I am a man your mother married this morning, so a fellow at the courthouse could not take you. And you may call me whatever you like." Jonas thought about it for a mile and settled on Mr. Hayes, and stayed with it for 2 years. The place lay in a bend where the river ran clear and green over limestone, with cypress standing in it. And there was a low house of dressed limestone, with a gallery, a cedar corral, a barn, a spring house built into the bank, and 60 acres of bottom that had been in corn once and was in weeds now. The house had 4 rooms and had been built for a family by a man who never got one. He carried in her bundle and set it on the floor and did not go past the doorway. "There is a bar on that door, and it works," he said. "I am in the barn from tonight. That is where I sleep, and that is not a thing you have got to think on again. There is a mare and a cart in the corral, and they are yours. And the Kerrville Road is that way, and there will not be one word said about it. Not the day nor after." Then he went out and did not come back in until she called him for supper, which was 4 days later. She was up at 4 the next morning. By the time Reuben Hayes came out of the barn at 5:30, Susanna Vogel had cleaned 11 months of leaf mold out of the spring house, scrubbed the limestone shelves with sand, found the crack in the trough that had been bleeding the flow into the bank, and packed it with clay. She had also fed his chickens, which he had been neglecting since February. He stood there a while with his coffee. "Ma'am," he said, "you have been here 9 hours. Yes, you do not owe me a spring house." "No," said Susanna Vogel, and went on with what she was doing. That was the first morning of a year, and the narrator will tell it plainly, because the year is what the story is. She nearly killed herself. She was a dairy woman. Her mother's people had made cheese in the old country and in Gillespie County after it, and Susanna Vogel could do things with a cow and a cellar that no other woman between Pardee and Comfort could do. Inside of 2 months, the spring house was cold and clean and full, and she was sending butter and a hard yellow cheese to Kerrville by the freight wagon. And by August, the cheese had a name and a waiting list, and the money went into a coffee tin, and the coffee tin went on the shelf, and she did not touch 1 cent of it. She kept a book. It was a child's copybook with a pasteboard cover, bought for a nickel in June, and in it Susanna Vogel wrote down everything. Boots, J, $1.40. Doctor from Kerrville, Aug 9, croup, $3 and his dinner. Schoolbook, G, 60C, nails, lamp oil, 3 gal. Beef, half a yearling. And down the right-hand side in a second column what she had put against it: butter, cheese, eggs, the garden, the mending, the whitewash, the corn she got in with a borrowed team, hours and hours and hours of work, priced out at what she reckoned a hired hand would cost, which was low. The 2 columns did not come near each other, and she knew it, and she worked harder. Reuben Hayes watched all of it, and could not for the life of him find the handle on it. He tried telling her plainly. He tried leaving off the meat bill. In September he took the copybook off the shelf and looked at it for a long minute and put it back exactly where it had been, and went out and split wood until dark. And in between, in the ordinary way, a year of days went by. He taught Jonas to sit a horse. He put a plank swing in the live oak for Greta without being asked and without mentioning it. And she found it, and he was in the barn when she did. He built a second room onto the spring house in October because the cheese had outgrown the first, and when Susanna tried to write down the lumber, he said, "That is mine. That is a improvement to my property," which was the only lie she ever caught him in. He noticed things and did not say them. He noticed she flinched at a raised voice, but not at thunder. He noticed she would not sit down to eat until everybody else had. He noticed that in 8 months she had not once asked him a single question about himself, and he understood that this was a kindness, and that it was also the loneliest kindness anybody had ever done him. One evening in the fall, he handed her down off the wagon seat, and their hands stayed joined about 2 seconds longer than the getting down required, and both of them let go at the same moment, and neither of them said anything. And she went in and stood in the kitchen for a while, with her hands still closed. In November, she was pulling up rotten boards in the barn loft to lay new ones, and under the third board, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a Bible. It was a cheap one, watermarked, and on the flyleaf in a child's labored pencil somebody had written Levi Cade, and under it Ada Cade, and under that 1858. Folded inside the back cover was a printed notice from the state of Missouri, dated 1873, offering $400 for a man wanted in connection with the death of a bank clerk at Sedalia, and the name on the notice was not Reuben Hayes. Susanna Vogel sat in the loft with that in her lap for a long time. Then she wrapped it up again exactly as she had found it, and put it back under the board, and nailed the board down, and did not say one word about it for 4 months, before the trouble came up that river road. And it did, and from a direction neither of them was watching, there was a good autumn on that place, and a swing in a live oak, and a spring house running cold. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a while longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything, and if you find yourself moved by tales of love that survived the worst the West could throw at them, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. Halbert Crow filed his petition in the county court at Kerrville on the 9th of December 1882. He asked the court to set aside the marriage of April as fraudulent and collusive, entered into for the sole purpose of defeating a lawful order of the overseer of the poor, and to bind out the Vogel children as originally directed. And the ground he stood on was one that every soul in the precinct knew to be true, because it had been remarked on in Pardee since May. They did not live as man and wife. He slept in the barn. There was no marriage there at all but the words. He can beat it one way, the lawyer in Kerrville told Reuben, in a room that smelled of cold cigars. You put yourself on the stand, and you satisfy that judge you are a man of substance and standing in this county. Where you was born, where you come from, what you was doing in 73, who can swear to you? He shuffled his papers. It is not much to ask of an honest man. Reuben Hayes sat in that chair for a while. No, he said. It ain't much. He did it on the 4th of January. He stood up in a courtroom in Kerrville and answered every question a county judge could think to ask him about the last 25 years of his life, in front of Halbert Crow and a clerk and 11 idle men off the square, and the answers were smooth and steady and mostly false. And every one of them was a rope he was handing to anybody who ever cared to pull it. The petition was denied on the 6th. Crow was assessed the costs, which came to $9.40, and he paid it in silver in front of the clerk and walked out without looking at anybody. Susanna was not in the courtroom. She was told about it by Ottilie Brandt, who had the next place upriver and who had been at the courthouse for a deed and had stayed for the show, a hard old German woman of 60-odd who had buried 2 husbands and did not think much of anybody. He stood up there an hour, Ottilie said, in the kitchen, with her hands around a cup. For a woman he does not touch, and 2 children not his. And he was afraid the whole time, Susanna. I have seen men afraid. He is very good at it, but I have seen it. That night, Susanna Vogel took the coffee tin off the shelf, 11 months of butter and cheese money, $118, and set it on the table in front of him and asked him to take it. He would not. And she stood there, and something in her that had been wound tight since the 11th of April came apart at last. "Then tell me what I owe," she said, "and I will pay it. I have carried it for a year, and it is breaking me. Every morning I get up, and I count. I have got a book on that shelf with 2 columns in it, and I am $900 behind and going backward, and there is not one thing you have asked of me. Not one. And that is not mercy. That is a weight." Her voice cracked all the way through. Nobody gives a stranger 400 acres of protection for nothing. Nobody. So tell me the price, Reuben Hayes, because I would rather know it than go on guessing at it in the dark. Reuben got up and got the copybook off the shelf and put it on the table. "Sit down," he said. "I will tell you why. I have been trying to work out how for 11 months. She sat. "In '58, he said, "in Vernon County, Missouri, the county sold my keep and bound out me and my sister off the courthouse steps at Nevada, Missouri, in the month of March. I was 11. Ada was 8. He was looking at the table. There was maybe 60 people in that square, and every one of them stood there and let it happen, and not one man in that county said, 'Hold on.' I have thought about that for 24 years. Not about the man that took me, about the 60 that watched. Susanna did not move. The fellow that got me had a lime kiln, and he worked me like a mule, and I run off at 15, and after that I fell in with men that took me in when nobody else would, and they were the wrong men, and I rode with them 6 years, and I am not going to sit here and pretty it up. I never killed anybody. I was there when it was done, and that is the same in law and pretty near the same everywhere else." He turned his hands over. "I walked off in 74 and come down here in 75 and bought that bottom with money I had no business having, and I have paid for it every year since by not sleeping much. Hayes is not the name I was born with. You know that. You have known since November, when you pulled up them boards in the loft and put them back." "Yes," said Susanna. "I know. I found the nails set different." Something that was almost a smile went across his face and did not stay. "You never asked. 11 months. Do you know what that is worth to a man like me?" "Ada," Susanna said. "What became of Ada?" "I do not know," said Reuben Hayes. "That is the whole of my life, right there in 4 words. I hunted her 9 years. She would be 32. The fire moved. Out in the dark, the river went over the limestone the way it had for 10,000 years. So here is your price," he said. "You have been trying for a year to pay me back for a thing I never done for you. I did not know your name when I said it. I did not look at you at all. I looked at that little girl on the step, and I was 11 years old again, and I would have married the devil's own sister that morning to stop it. It was not a gift, Susanna. It was me settling an account I have owed since 1858, and you have spent 12 months trying to hand me back money I already spent on myself." He opened the copybook to the last written page. "You have got 2 columns in here," he said, "and you have kept the wrong one." He took her pencil. "I ain't lettered enough to make it pretty, but I have ate at a table at 6 o'clock every night for a year. There has been a lamp burning in that window every night I come up from the barn, and I have stood out there in the dark and looked at it more times than I will say. There is a boy on this place, calls me Mr. Hayes, like it is a title. Last April the verse was a man with 400 acres, and nobody on earth who would have noticed if I had not come back off the river. He wrote it down, slow, in his cramped hand, in the right-hand column. You want the total, ma'am. That is the total. It does not come out the way you have been figuring it. Susanna Vogel put her hands over her face and wept for the first time since the 11th of April, 1882. And when she was done, she got up and crossed that kitchen floor herself, which is worth setting down, because there was not one thing in the world compelling her to do it. What passed between them then was brief. It was the first kiss either of them had known in a long while, and what broke open in her was not longing, but the plain, unbearable relief of setting down a weight she had been told 100 times she did not have to carry, and had never once been able to believe until that night. Levi, she said after, that is the name in the Bible. It was. Then I will use it in this house, said Susanna, and nowhere else, ever, as long as we live. Halbert Crow had written to Missouri in October, and the answer came in February. It came in the person of a man named Rufus Deal, who had ridden with that outfit in '73 and had done the thing at Sedalia himself, and who had spent 9 years perfectly content with a $400 notice hanging over another man's name, right up until a letter from a freight agent in Texas told him exactly where that man was living, and made him understand that a witness at large is a rope that has not been tied yet. Deal came up the river road on the 19th of February with 2 men at 2 in the morning and fired the barn to bring Reuben out of it. He came out. Deal shot him twice at the corner of the Cedar Corral and left him, and the 3 of them rode for the Kerrville Road, believing the fire and the dark would finish the account. Susanna Vogel had the children in the spring house behind 2 feet of limestone before the barn roof went. Then she went out into the yard with a quilt and found her husband 40 feet from the corral and got him onto the sled they used for rock and dragged him in and packed the wound high on his side and bound it and did not stop the bleeding so much as slow it, and knew it. She did not take up a rifle. There was nobody left to shoot at. What she did was hitch the mare to the cart at 3:30 in the morning and put 2 children in the bed with their father and every quilt in that house on top of him, and drive 11 miles to Pardee in the dark, over a road she had been down perhaps 9 times in her life. She came into the square at first light on the 20th of February, 1883, and she stopped the cart at the foot of the courthouse steps, in the same 40 feet of dust where the county had bound out her children 10 months before. And she stood up in the wagon bed with her husband's blood dried to her forearms and the copybook in her hand. And she waited until there were enough of them. There were maybe 70. It was not court day. They came anyway. 10 months ago you stood in this square, said Susanna Vogel, and you watched a man bid $2 on my daughter, and not one of you said a word. Nobody said a word then, either. That man in this wagon is Reuben Hayes, and he married me on those steps in front of you. And every one of you has since made a joke of it, and I have heard the jokes. She opened the copybook. So I am going to read you what he has done since, because I wrote it down, all of it, for a year, every item, because I am a fool and I thought I was keeping a debt. She read it out. Boots for a boy of 5 in June, $1.40. A doctor fetched 11 miles from Kerrville at 2 in the morning in August, when Greta had the croup, $3 and his dinner. A school book, 60 cents, a plank swing in a live oak that never appeared on any bill because he had not thought it was a thing that got written down. A room built onto a spring house in October for a woman's cheese, $41 of milled lumber entered by him under improvements to his own property, which was a lie. 310 nights in a barn, in the cold, 11 feet from a house with 4 rooms in it. And on the 4th of January, she said, he stood up in a courtroom in Kerrville for an hour and let a judge ask him anything he wanted, so that Halbert Crow could not have my children. Mr. Crow is standing at the back of this crowd, and he has known since October what that hour cost, because he is the one who wrote to Missouri to find out. 70 people turned around. Mr. Crow stood to make 11 years of a boy's labor and 13 of a girl's, said Susanna Vogel. And he lost it in 11 minutes to a stranger, and last night 3 men came up my river road and burned my barn on the strength of a letter he wrote. I cannot prove the letter. He can tell you about it himself. The narrator was not there and will not embroider it. What is on record is that the sheriff of Kerr County took Halbert Crow into the courthouse that morning and did not take him back out. That Reuben Hayes, from the bed of a farm cart in the middle of the square, told that sheriff where a man named Otis Fuel could be found in Sedalia, Missouri, who had been standing 11 feet away in 1873 and had seen who fired, and that Rufus Deal and one of his 2 men were taken on the Bandera Road at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Deal was hanged at Sedalia in the November of 1883 on Otis Fuel's evidence. The notice against Levi Cade was withdrawn by the state of Missouri in the same term, and the governor's clerk sent a paper saying so. And it is in a frame in that house today. Halbert Crow was removed as overseer of the poor in March, indicted in June for soliciting the burning, acquitted in September on a jury that included 2 of his freight customers, and left Kerr County in 1884 for reasons of business. Nobody in Pardee ever bought anything from him again. The bullet high on Reuben's side gave him a stiff shoulder in cold weather for the rest of his life, and Susanna maintained until she was 80 that this was her fault for not getting to him faster, and nobody was ever able to argue her out of it. They were married again in the spring, which they did not need to be, in the Lutheran church at Comfort, with Ottilie Brandt in the second pew being audibly satisfied. The Vogel children took the name Hayes in 1885 because they asked to. At the supper table, having discussed it privately between themselves for a month like a pair of lawyers. In 1887, a letter came from a woman in Sedalia, Missouri, who had read a newspaper account of a hanging 4 years before and had spent that long working up the nerve. Her name had been Ada Cade. She came down to Texas in the October of that year and stayed 6 weeks, and came back every year after that until 1901, and there is a photograph of the 2 of them on the gallery of that limestone house, standing about a foot apart, neither one of them smiling, both of them plainly unable to look at the camera. The copybook with the pasteboard cover stayed on the shelf in that kitchen for 51 years. Susanna never made another entry in it after the 19th of February 1883. She did not throw it out either. It sat between the coffee tin and the lamp, and when the grandchildren got old enough to read, they would haul it down and puzzle at it. A year of a woman's life in 2 columns, boots and lamp oil and butter and eggs, and then, at the bottom of the last written page, 7 lines in a man's cramped pencil that did not have any dollars in them at all. They would ask what the second column meant, every one of them, sooner or later. And their grandmother would take the book and look at it a minute, and put it back on the shelf between the tin and the lamp, and say the same thing she said every time. It means I was wrong about which one of us was doing the giving. Now go and wash. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out in the hill country of Texas, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Levi Cade and Susanna Vogel became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real. Though they remembered it in Pardee a good long while, every soul who stood in that square and said nothing, and a few who finally did. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.